Hi guys, Bill the Appraiser here with a new episode of All About Appraisals. Topic of the day today is approaches to value. Um, so when we talk about approaches to value, there's kind of the big three, as I call them, that you should see touched on in most all the appraisals you see. The big approach to value is the sales comparison approach. That's the one everybody's familiar with. That's really what you're seeing when you look at an appraisal and you see the grid and you see the subject property and you see the comps laid out and you see the adjustments plus and minus and you see the Q's and C's and all that. That's the sales comparison approach. And that's really the one that I think most people rely on the most, lenders rely on the most, that people are most familiar with. Now, in the appraisal world, like I said, there are three approaches to value. That's one of them. The other two are the income approach and the cost approach. Income approach being if you were going to rent the property out, how much could you get for it? And based on that number, you can arrive at a value for the property. I would say by and large, appraisers don't generally do that one unless it's required, and it's generally not. Although I think the rules of the game really say the appraiser is supposed to do all the approaches to value that apply, but most appraisers, I think, will probably say for a single family residential home, well, it's not a rental property, and so the income approach has not been done. The other approach to value is the cost approach. How much would it cost to reconstruct the property minus depreciation due to the age. So you have three approaches to value. Those are the big three. And again, most everybody's concerned about the sales comparison approach. Now, having said that, and if you never noticed, in most appraisals, you may see the cost approach that I just mentioned because lenders sometimes require because I think they use that value on occasion to benchmark the amount they require the homeowner to insure the home for. Because obviously what the home is worth today as opposed to the cost it would be to what the cost would be to rebuild are two different numbers. And so that's why they would use a cost approach for that, because that'd be a bigger value. And by the same token, as an appraiser, it's not that unusual for someone to tell me, when I get there and I'm doing my thing and they tell me, well, the insurance company made me insurance for $500,000 or whatever. And it's like, well, that's all well and good, but that got nothing to do with me. Because I'm all about sales comparison approach. Where's your neighbor sell for? What did the one down the road sell for? What did other things like you sell for? Not a question of what would it cost to recreate you. And there's a couple of aspects of that we won't get into here. But there are variations on a theme. I had somebody contact me not too long ago, and he told me up front, which is good, because sometimes people wait and kind of spring things on the appraiser after the fact, and then all of a sudden that changes things, might change how the appraiser would quote the project. But in this particular one, the individual had bought the land. One individual had bought the land, fine. And then at some point after the first individual bought the land, then that individual and another family member had paid to have a house built on the land. And now, some number of years later, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, who knows, now they are looking to sell that. So the person who had originally bought the land, wants to know, of course, what the current value of the land is, and then they want to, so that he can get all of that back for himself because he paid for the land to begin with, and then the value of the home separated out so they can split that because that's what they built together, so to speak. So and there are probably ways to do that. That's not my wheelhouse. That's not my area of expertise. So things like that I tend to turn down. Although on occasion people come back after the fact and say, hey, we were just curious. What about this? What about that? What about the other? So there's also a thing out there called a remainder. And so what happens sometimes is someone has a property, and let's say it's a 2,000 square foot home on 5 acres, and they want to carve off 1 acre to give to a family member. And so then the bank wants a series of 3 appraisals done, one for the whole shebang all together as it sits today. Then they want 2 other appraisals done on the piece that's going to be carved off and the piece that's going to be left. And so that's called a remainder. I've done one of those, will suit me just fine if I never do another, just because in theory, I can appreciate how, yes, they should more or less line up before and after, but my experience with the one that I was involved in was that it did not. Now, who knows? Maybe I wasn't doing quite right. I don't know. Eventually, we did work it out, and the reviewer in the bank was happy with the results, and so we all went home happy. But whenever that comes up, and I see that in an email when someone's asking for that, I just say no. Although they are generally a pretty good fee, because obviously the appraiser is likely getting paid for at least 2, if not 3 appraisals. I think the idea is that the appraiser would probably charge a full fee for the whole thing, and then potentially a discounted fee for the other 2 pieces, for the total of 3. But appraisals are also sliced and diced in what we call as is or subject to. So as far as approaches to value, this isn't really an approach to value, but it does impact value. In that, I would say the vast majority of appraisals that are done as is. As is simply means the way it sits here today. And that's generally the way most banks want it done. If you're having a refi, or if it's or a HELOC, or even if it's a purchase, but banks don't like things that are safety issues. And so even if it's a conventional loan, if there are safety issues, the bank would expect the appraiser to make the appraisal subject to remediation, repair, correction, however you want to phrase it, of the potential safety issues. Case in point, maybe they have a deck, maybe it's 25 feet off the ground, maybe it looks like it's about to fall through, maybe you can stand under the deck and see daylight up top coming through the deck. That won't fly. So the appraiser would have to make the appraisal subject to repair and or replacement of the deck due to the poor condition, because nobody wants to be on the hook for a safety issue. So things can also be done subject to something being added to the property, maybe a 2-car garage attached, maybe 500 square foot master suite with a new bedroom and a new bathroom, that type of thing. If they're subject to. So in the subject to scenario, the appraiser kind of pretends like that amenity or those amenities are already there, and then the appraiser gives credit for that as they search for comparable sales, and then make adjustments accordingly, acting as if those amenities are already in place. And then ultimately the bank, the borrower, comes back to the appraiser and says, hey, we've got these things done, come back out, take some photos, send to the bank, and that way they'll know we've done the things we said we were going to do. That's called a 1004D final inspection, or not really recertification. Currently the form has 2 purposes. When the appraisal changes later this year, I think that kind of goes away. But yeah, the 1004D final inspection does currently exist, and that's what an appraiser would do. If an appraisal was done subject to, the appraiser would go back out, take a few photos, send a little mini report, 2 or 3 pages, to the bank to let them know the work had been done and that they could all move forward with the transaction. Last but not least here in this, I have a difference in value between a private appraisal and a lender appraisal. And so again, not really an approach to value, but a difference in value. And you might wonder, gosh, why would there be a difference in value, whether it's for private appraisal, someone who just wanted an estimate of value, or whatever the reason was. It may not be just an estimate of value, but it could be an estimate of value as a pre-listing appraisal. It could be an estimate of value due to a date of death situation. It could be an estimate of value simply due to probate. It could be an estimate of value due to divorce. So all sorts of reasons. But I would venture to guess that, when, excuse me, when an appraiser is doing an appraisal for a lender, they have to follow all the rules and everything. It has to sort of comply. And it has to conform. I think it's really the word I was looking for, not really comply, but conform, because it's going to go to a lender. It's a federally regulated transaction, so every rule in the world applies to that. Now, when an appraiser is doing it as a private appraisal, simply as an estimate of value, or any of the other scenarios I just mentioned, those rules don't necessarily apply quite as much. So the appraiser has a bit more leeway. Case in point, for any federally regulated transaction, 99 times out of 100, the first 3 comparable sales are all going to be from the past 12 months. And depending on specific lender requirements, maybe even the past 6 months, maybe even the past 3 months, who knows. But when an appraiser is doing something as a private appraisal for a private individual, they have a lot of leeway. I won't say they can do what they want to do, but they have a lot more leeway. So they could potentially even use sales that are over a year old. On the first page of comparable sales, they might even decide to use a listing. on the front page, and in a perfect world, they would explain what they've done inside the report, and that way the intended user would understand what's going on. But I've done several, probably hesitate to say many, but I've done several appraisals over the years where a pre-listing type thing was done in a non-lender scenario, and the appraiser maybe came up with a little higher value than what it can appraise for now. Not necessarily a higher value than what the contract is, because as a general rule, pre-listing appraisal is done. All the parties concerned look at that. They go out and list it. Then they get a bite, so to speak. They get a potential buyer, and so possibly the contract is very close to that non-lender appraisal value that came in. And then the appraiser who's doing it for the bank comes in, and they have to play by all the rules. And so they're trying to find sales in the last 12 months that would support the estimate of value, and they're going back trying to do that. Maybe they can, maybe they can't. Also depending on the time frame there, because everybody knows an appraisal is good until the ink is dry. After that, it's really no longer valid. You have to go out, find new comps, and get a new appraisal. So if it's been more than 3, 4, 5, 6 months, there's every possibility in the world that some of those comparable sales that were potentially originally used in the non-lender report have now timed out, which means the next appraiser cannot use them, or if they use them, they have to be on page 2, and they certainly can't be given most value because they're likely older sales at this point. So if for whatever reason the more recent sales happen to be older, the second appraiser coming in after the fact might have a hard time appraising something for as high a value as the original appraiser did. 1, because of the time element. 2, because it was non-lender then, it's lender now, and so things are a little bit different. So non-lender, lender, remainder, 3 approaches to value, sales comparison approach, cost approach, income approach, all sorts of things out there. Hope this was informative. Hope this told you something you didn't know. Feel free to hit like and subscribe. Feel free to leave a comment, and any ideas for upcoming videos, just leave that as well, and I'll get to it quick as I can. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I will see you on the next video. Thanks again. Bye-bye.